Our speaker for this evening is Jonathan Hodge. Dr. Hodge is an associate professor and assistant chair in the Department of Mathematics at Grand Valley State University in Allendale, Michigan. He earned his PhD in mathematics from Western Michigan University and recently completed a master's degree in negotiation, conflict resolution, and peace building from California State University, Dominguez Hills. Dr. Hodge is the co-director of Grand Valley State University's Summer Mathematics Research Experience for Undergraduates program, and he has mentored more than a dozen students in undergraduate research projects in the area of voting and social choice theory. Dr. Hodge is the co-director of the university's summer, I'm sorry, I just said that, didn't I? I lost my place. Here we go. Dr. Hodge is the co-author of The Mathematics of Voting and Elections, a hands-on approach, published in 2005 by the AMS, and also Abstract Algebra, an inquiry-based approach, to be published by Taylor and Francis next year. He has been a practitioner of inquiry-based learning for the past 10 years, but says that he considers himself even less of an expert now than when he first began. It sounds as if he struck a resonant chord with that comment. At any rate, we shall see. It's my pleasure to give you Jonathan Hodge.
Thank you. Let's see, there's my mic. Okay. That was quite an introduction. I'm not sure if my talk can live up to it. Boy, when I was first asked to come and speak at the banquet of the Legacy of R.L. Moore Conference, my thought was, I wonder if Ted Mahavier and Mike Starbird and all the other usual suspects just couldn't make it. But I see that they're here. So I'm beginning to think that I was not chosen out of desperation, which places some pressure on me to say something of note. So I will try not to disappoint. In all seriousness, it's an honor to be speaking to you tonight. This is a real privilege, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. I'm going to start by quoting myself, which is perhaps not a great way to start a talk, but I'm going to do it. The last time I spoke the first time I spoke at the Moore Conference was in 2004, and I was on a panel, and I talked about the top 10 things I have learned about discovery-based teaching. And after that, I wrote an article in Primus that basically said the same thing that I said in the talk. I had only been using inquiry-based learning for about 2 years at the time. And what I said is, I guess it was even an exaggeration to say I've only been doing this for a few years. But I didn't really think I was that good at it, but I was going to share what I could share, whatever was useful. I think I thought at the time that the more I practiced, the more I used inquiry-based learning, the more of an expert I would become, and that eventually I would think that I had sort of arrived. Which brings me to my next quote. Professor for a negotiation class I had says, I've been doing this for years, and I'm far from an expert. If I'm an expert on anything, it's on enjoying the learning experience. So my comments tonight are offered in that spirit. I'm not going to talk to you as an expert or as an authority in inquiry-based learning, but as another voice in the conversation. And it's a conversation that includes all of your voices and that is richer because of that. So I want to begin with an observation. I have noticed that students both crave and resist authority. Okay? So I teach a class on voting theory. One of the first things we do is we talk about two-person elections, two-candidate elections. They're very simple, actually. There are some silly voting systems for two-candidate elections, but there's really only one reasonable voting system, and that's majority rule. But I don't tell them that right away. I let them discover that. So I propose these two, dictatorship and imposed rule. And they're very resistant to this. They don't like either of these. I don't know why. And so I make the observation that students tend to support democratic processes and resist decision-making mechanisms that are viewed as exclusionary or authoritarian. At the same time, when one tries to teach using an inquiry-based method, one encounters a certain amount of resistance from students who say, just tell me what to do, all right? Or they appeal to themselves as the authority. They say, I know how to do this. I shouldn't have to explain it to you. My favorite comment from student evaluations is, don't assume everyone can come up with ideas of their own. Laughable if it wasn't true and sad. So the question then is, why do so many students and instructors prefer authoritarian approaches to instruction? And this gets me to my second observation, and that is that democracy is messy. Okay, anyone who's studied voting theory knows that lots of things can go wrong when you try to make decisions in a democratic way. Okay, majorities can be wrong. It has happened before. Okay, reasonable processes involving reasonable people can lead to unreasonable results. I study referendum elections. You can construct preferences very easily where the winning outcome is the last choice of every single voter. Okay, not something that we would consider a very good outcome by any measure. Irrelevant events can affect outcomes. And from a broader perspective, engaging in democratic processes requires a lot of effort. You have to think critically. You have to use discernment skills. It's not easy. It's easier to just be told what to do. And so I would suggest that authoritarianism is an easy way to avoid the messiness of democracy. I think that's why many students crave appeals to authority. I think that's why many instructors approach their teaching from an authoritarian point of view. But we're not here to talk about how to teach in authoritarian ways. I think that those of us in this room are here because we believe in a different set of ideals. And so I asked you, prior to my talk, I sent out an email. I asked you to tell me what it meant for a classroom to be democratic. And some of you actually did the assignment. It was very impressive. This is something, by the way, I do in my classes sometimes. I put a Google document up and let the class contribute to it. And it's a nice way to let students either set the agenda for a class or have some input into the class before the class even starts. It seems a little funny, although I'm somewhat doing that now, to come to a conference on inquiry-based learning and lecture to you. But at least I am going to incorporate your views into my talk here. So here's a couple of quotes. And the screen is fuzzy, and so I'm not sure if you can read them. So let me just point out a few things. Several of you appealed to common mathematical assumptions or underlying mathematical principles as being the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong and what establishes the equal footing that would make a mathematics classroom democratic. So we have deductive logic, we have mathematical assumptions, we have the rules of mathematics. These are available to everyone, both the students and the instructor. Some of you focused on having different voices heard and valued. Some of you talked about agreement, that we must agree on details and also be able to question each other. It was brought up that a democratic classroom must be a trusting community and that participants have equal say on the decisions made. Some of you did not share that perspective. And this is good. And in typical inquiry-based style, I have no intention of resolving the difference. But some of you expressed concerns about what a democratic classroom would look like. It sounds like all opinions are equally valuable, and I don't buy into that. It doesn't mean that the students and the teacher have equal weight in deciding what's right and wrong. And a democratic classroom doesn't just correspond to majority rule. And that last sentiment really aligns well with more sophisticated ideas about democracy, where really democracy is about more than majority rule. I mean, majority rule is a very simple way of defining democracy for very simple situations, but situations get more complex as more issues are involved, and we need to look beyond sort of what seems like the most obvious solutions. A couple of perspectives from the research literature. A democratic classroom is a learning environment in which students are participants, in which all positions are equally respected without necessarily being equally valued. I thought that was an interesting phrase. And where evaluation of different positions takes place through critical inquiry. Okay? Dialogue and inquiry is an important part. The next quote mentions many of the same things, and students choose their daily activities, and there's shared decision-making. So I'm sure that in a room this size, we could not come to a consensus on what exactly a democratic classroom is, but I do think that most of us here subscribe to the basic principles of active involvement in the learning process, opportunities for diverse voices to be heard, and the pursuit of knowledge through critical inquiry. I think these are sort of the foundations of what many of us do in our own classrooms. These are not new ideas. Pryor points out that John Dewey, back in 1933, suggested that engaging students in self-directed learning would allow them to think independently, but also consider the needs of others, and that this combination would make better citizens and folks who are better able to engage in democratic processes. And at this point, I know I'm going to be preaching to the choir, but Pryor also summarized a whole host of other benefits of the democratization of learning. And these are things that fit very well with, I think, what those of us who practice inquiry-based learning try to accomplish in our classrooms. So increased ability to hypothesize, explain, expand, question, and probe, practice and reasoned inquiry. These are all fantastic abilities that we try to instill in our students, that we try to foster in our students through inquiry-based learning. Now this brings me to my next question. If we put democracy on one end of the spectrum and authoritarianism on the other end of the spectrum, I would ask then, what does it mean for a classroom to have authority exercised? And in what ways is it proper for an instructor in an inquiry-based class to be an authority? So here's what one of you said. The teacher really shouldn't be an authority. The teacher should be more of a moderator. Teacher should stimulate discussion, ask interesting questions, never give the ultimate yes or no. But this is hedged a little bit. Who wrote this quote said, the teacher should never give the ultimate yes or no, but should guide students along the path of finding out if there are flaws in arguments, if there are errors that need to be corrected, by probing and asking good questions and engaging in more inquiry to uncover what might be incorrect or what might need to be improved in a particular proof or solution. On the other hand, again, we don't have unanimity, big surprise. One of you said there are times when it's appropriate to step in and suggest corrections. Another of you said that the authority in the teacher comes from the trust that the students have in them, and in the way that they establish the learning environment by choosing mathematical questions that are worth exploring. But that authority has to be shared. The teacher can't grasp it and remain completely in control of the classroom or of the mathematics. The authority has to be shared with the students. A couple of you said that, one of you said that the instructor represents the discipline, and so it is appropriate for the instructor to exercise intellectual authority. Another perspective is that the authority exercised by a teacher should be based on experience, not necessarily on intellect, and that the instructor should take care even in exercising that authority. And consistent with one of the previous quotes, the author of this quote views the teacher as a facilitator or perhaps a mediator. So we have lots of different views about what it means for a classroom to be democratic. We have lots of different views about what level of authority is appropriate in an inquiry-based classroom. My question for you is, can authority and democracy coexist in the inquiry-based classroom? And I think to answer this question, we have to use a little bit more precise definitions. So I don't know if these are the best definitions. These are how the dictionary defines authority. So here's two definitions, two very different definitions. The first, the power to give orders, make decisions, enforce obedience. Now admit it, sometimes you want to do that, right? Okay? Sometimes you wish that you had that kind of power. And I guess you could if you wanted to. But a very different notion of authority is authority comes from the power to have influence. As instructors, as mathematicians, we come to the classroom with a certain knowledge and experience base, and we have an enormous power to influence the tone of the discussion, the direction that a discussion takes, and that's a form of authority. So I would suggest that the compatibility of authority and democracy really depends on how we conceptualize authority, particularly if we conceptualize authority as unilateral power or as shared influence. I also think there is a key distinction to be made between being authoritative and being authoritarian. Okay? I think all of us would like to be trusted, would like to be viewed as reliable, would like to be respected by our students, would like to be viewed as authoritative in that sense. That's very different than being dictatorial or domineering or showing a lack of concern for the wishes or opinions of others. We've all probably had teachers that we feel fall into that latter description. And I am confident that those of us in this room are not interested in having our students view us that way. I think what this comes down to is that an authoritarian teacher is the analog of a dictator, whereas an authoritative teacher is a fellow citizen. Perhaps a very respected citizen, perhaps a citizen with an enormous amount of influence. In a democracy, not all players, not all participants have the same amount of influence and power. A democratic classroom does not have to have an equal distribution of influence and power. But I think the key here is that in a democratic classroom, authority is shared among the students and the instructor. Along these lines, Collin and Haney wrote about the balance of power between students and teachers. Teachers have some obvious sources of power, right? We give grades, okay? We determine students' futures in some way. You know, I have a student in my class right now that has told me, if I don't get a C in this class, I can't do my student teaching. I have an enormous amount of power over this student's future right now, and it's power that at times I wish I didn't have, okay? But we do have that power. Collin and Haney argue that power from students comes in the strength of their numbers, right? There's only one of me in the classroom. There's a bunch of them. They can gang up on me if they want to. Sometimes they do. But this balance of power demands that we engage education collaboratively, that education is by and with the students, not presented to them. And I think, again, that is very consistent with the ideals that we try to promote in inquiry-based learning. So here's my challenge. And this is a question that those of you who have much more experience than me might have very good answers to that might be different than what my answers are. But as I was thinking about this, the questions that came to my mind are, how can I create an environment in which my students are actively engaged, in which diverse perspectives are respected and evaluated critically, where influence and decision-making is in fact shared, and where I have an authoritative presence but not an authoritarian presence? Now, to answer this question, I'm going to turn to my studies of conflict resolution. And as I thought about this more, I thought about some of the work I've been doing recently as a mediator. So I have an interesting hobby. I mediate court cases. Okay, a debt collection case, for instance. A company is suing somebody, and the judge says, don't waste my time, settle this outside of court. They refer the case to mediation, and so I sit down at the table with the two parties and try to get them to come to some sort of agreement. And as I thought about the process of mediation, I thought there's some real analogs to what we try to do in an inquiry-based classroom. So let me explain a little bit about mediation. Mediation is a process that values the autonomy of the parties involved. So mediators do not impose their own solutions on the parties. Mediators are neutral. They sit down, they help the parties communicate, but ultimately the agreement that the parties reach is owned by them. It's a voluntary agreement that they come to on their own terms. You can think of it as facilitated negotiation. You have two parties with different goals, and the mediator helps them come together and uncover shared interests and find an incentive to come to an agreement in a legal setting, out of court. This is a really important part of the U.S. legal system now because court dockets are becoming increasingly full, and judges are relying on mediation to clear those dockets to get cases settled outside of court. So in many cases, mediation is mandated by the court, and you have parties coming into it under those circumstances. Mediation is different than other dispute resolution methods in that the control remains entirely in the hands of the participants. A good mediator will not impose their views on the participants. They let the parties come to agreement on their own. So as I said before, it's a process that values agency, that values autonomy. With that in mind, as I said, I gave a top 10 list talk like 8 years ago now here that went over pretty well, so I thought I'd try that again. I also thought we're at the point where you've all just eaten dessert. You're probably a little tired. You're getting to the point where you might be asking, how long do I have to listen to this guy? So the answer is you can count down these 10 points, and then we're about 80% of the way done, okay? So just for those of you who like to know where things stand. 10 things inquiry-based teachers can learn from effective mediators and negotiators. First thing, effective mediators educate participants about unfamiliar processes and roles. When I sit down with a mediation, and almost any mediation starts with an opening statement by the mediator. Participants, especially unrepresented clients in a lawsuit, come to this mediation having no idea what mediation is. We have to explain to them what their role is, what the role of the mediator is, what their rights are, what the expectations are. We have to go through all of that so that they're comfortable participating in the process. I think students in inquiry-based classes often come to the table having no idea what inquiry-based learning is. They don't know what the expectations are, what their role is, what the instructor's role is. We have to make that clear. Okay. The next thing that an effective mediator does is give each side a chance to tell their own perspective on the matter before them. And they build trust by listening and acknowledging participants' emotions and experiences. I was at a talk earlier today where, what was it, the most common concern among instructors who are trying inquiry-based learning is difficulties the students are having. Was that right? So these difficulties, it would be better, would you agree, if they didn't just come out on your student evaluations at the end of the semester? If you don't have the kind of demeanor, the kind of welcoming spirit that is going to allow students to feel comfortable voicing those concerns, voicing those frustrations, to let them be heard, to let them be understood, and to let them feel some sort of confidence in engaging in the process, you're unlikely to get buy-in, I think. So this is something that we all need to do. We need to listen to our students. We need to generally, we need to listen to them in a way that lets them feel heard. It's been said that the cheapest concession a negotiator can make is letting the other person know they've been heard. Something else to keep in mind is that acknowledging someone's experiences is not the same as agreeing with their perspective. Okay? You can acknowledge someone's emotions and completely disagree with the substance of what they're saying. You don't have to agree for them to feel heard and for that to be a beneficial experience. Effective mediators don't make assumptions about what the parties are thinking or what their goals are, what they're trying to accomplish. We ask questions from a perspective of not knowing. I think in the classroom, sometimes we kind of think we've got a student figured out. And it's really hard to listen to them. They just keep going on and on. Oh, okay, I get what you're saying. They need to be heard. And sometimes if we listen, we learn things that we wouldn't have known otherwise. We learn that we actually didn't know what they were struggling with, that we didn't understand the questions they were asking as much as we thought we did. But if we go into the situation with a perspective that, oh, I know how this is going to go, we're not going to hear that, and we're not going to be able to adjust it and accommodate those questions and those concerns. This is a really important one, and one that was mentioned in a previous quote. Effective mediators guide discussions by asking questions of genuine interest. Effective mediators ask lots of questions. When I'm mediating, I ask a lot of questions. I will scapegoat myself. If a client know the difference between a stipulated dismissal and a consent judgment, which I didn't know the difference between those before I did mediation. Probably most of you don't know the difference. If you were in a mediation, you wouldn't have any clue. I pretend that I don't know. I say, I'm not a lawyer. Could you just explain to me again? I'll ask one of the lawyers in the room. Could you just explain to me again the difference between these two options? Because the lawyers are really good at convincing people to do things that they really shouldn't be doing. And they don't like it when you actually ask them to explain the consequences of what they're trying to get somebody to do. But they have to when you ask them, could you just explain the difference between this? And then sometimes they'll explain it, and the other party, the defendant, will be like, well, I don't like that at all. Now, I haven't told them, well, you shouldn't do that. I've asked a question that guides the discussion in a way that's going to reveal information so that they can come to that conclusion on their own. I think that's a lot of what we do in inquiry-based learning. We ask questions that get students to come to their own conclusions. Effective mediators facilitate rather than dictate. This goes along with what I said earlier. We don't impose our solutions on the parties. But effective mediators are not passive. You ever get those comments in your student evaluations that say, she doesn't teach. She just sits in the back of the room. What was it? The favorite comment, another talk I heard today. Sits in the back of the room with his arms crossed and goes, Okay? I think most of us do more than that. We have a responsibility, I would say, to make sure that the important issues are brought to the table. And that's what mediators do. If there's an aspect of the discussion, an aspect of the case that's not being discussed, a good mediator will ask questions to bring that out. And we'll also work to elicit participation from all of the parties. Sometimes a defendant's attorney will want to speak for them completely. And they don't even want to let the defendant speak. And every time the defendant starts to speak up, the attorney's like, well, this is what she really wants. Say, could we hear from her? And sometimes you learn things from those sorts of conversations. So mediators, and I would suggest effective teachers as well, work to elicit participation from all of the parties. Effective mediators help parties explore multiple solutions, but they refrain from imposing their own views and judgments, at least not explicitly. Okay, like I said before, if I'm mediating a case and I see that the parties are about to enter into an agreement that is clearly unfair to one party or that just doesn't make any sense by any stretch of the imagination, I'm going to ask some questions to try to steer the conversation towards some other options. I'm going to try to help the parties explore some other solutions. But if in the end they want to agree to something that doesn't make sense to me, I'm going to let them. But I'm going to try to guide the discussion in a way that, that without imposing my own views, reveals concerns that might be present. Now, mediation has facilitated negotiation, so we can learn a lot from negotiation theory too. Effective negotiators work collaboratively. I don't know, for a while I felt like my relationship with my students was adversarial. And there's a lot of ways of structuring your classroom so that it legitimately is that way. But in thinking about what we talked about earlier with the inquiry-based teacher as being a fellow citizen in the classroom, someone with shared influence, shared authority, I think this really suggests that if we view our students more as peers, not necessarily on the same footing, but as collaborators in an endeavor together, we'll have better success. And that's certainly the case with conflict resolution. The key to effective conflict resolution is to steer the discussion away from competitive options into collaboration, to provide incentives for collaboration. Effective negotiators are firm about their basic interests, but flexible about how these interests are met. Okay. You ever get in a fight with, I don't know, somebody, anybody, significant other, friend, and after a while you forget what you're fighting about? You don't even know how it started. You just want to win. Okay? We often don't engage conflict in particularly purposeful ways. But effective negotiators do. They think about what their real interests are, what they're really trying to accomplish. I used to view suggestions from students as sort of adversarial, that they were criticizing me in some way if they suggested that I do things differently. I've taken a different approach now. I evaluate suggestions from students against what my interests are and what I'm trying to accomplish in the classroom. If a student makes a suggestion that is not in conflict with my interests, that's completely compatible with what my objectives are, it does an enormous amount to build trust and to build respect in the classroom to say, that's a great idea, let's try that. So to meet my interests still, but to be flexible about the way that I'm meeting them. And finally, teaching is hard. Conflict resolution is hard. Anything meaningful is hard, right? Effective negotiators, effective mediators, effective practitioners of conflict resolution, and I would say effective teachers, constantly work to become more in touch and more in tune with who they are as a person, what their own biases are, what triggers them emotionally, and constantly strive to improve themselves. And that's the basis of what Lee said in my introduction. You know, this word expert bothers me. Sometimes when we have experience doing something, people attach that label of expert to us. And to me, that's always intimidating because it has this sense of finality to it. That, oh, I've arrived at this point where now I can be considered an expert. But I don't view anything that I do in that way, at least anything that's meaningful. I might be an expert at like eating food, but anything that has meaning to it, it involves constant reflection and improvement. And so I don't like to view myself in those terms. And I would suggest that being reflective is one of the key elements of being an effective teacher. Now, there is one little caveat here where my analogy breaks down. Being a teacher, we have to assign grades at the end. So we're not really entirely mediators. At the end of the semester, something's got to give, and we've got to attach some sort of judgment on the students. And this slide could be the basis of an entirely different talk, but I want to just mention a few things that have worked for me, directions that I've taken to kind of negotiate this balance. The main strategy that I've been employing for about the last 5 years is to separate my judgment of students' work in terms of a final grade from my other interactions with them throughout the semester. So I base my assessment on objectives. Every test question, every portfolio problem is attached to certain course objectives, and students have multiple opportunities to demonstrate mastery of these. I don't give any summative assessment throughout the semester. On homework, I write my comments, but I don't put a numerical grade. At the end of the semester, my students turn in a portfolio. They'll select 5 problems out of a certain collection of problems, and this constitutes sort of a representative sample of their best work. They don't get their grade, their final grade on that portfolio, until after we're done interacting and the final grades are issued. And I think what this has allowed me to do is remain in the role of sort of being an advocate for student learning without being a judge throughout the semester. So I use a lot of I statements. Instead of saying, this is confusing, when I write feedback on a student paper, I might say, I'm having a hard time following your argument. Okay? It's not like the gods of mathematics have decreed that this argument is awful. It's just that me, as a mathematician, that you probably want to convince, I'm not entirely convinced right now. So let's talk about it. Maybe I don't fully understand what you're doing. Let's talk about how you might be able to make that more clear to me. Students really like this right versus wrong demarcation. And it's so artificial in some sense, and so I really try to avoid it. I talk about strengths of arguments. I talk about differences between arguments. I talk about areas for improvement. But if a student asks me, is this right? I hate that question. I don't respond that way. Don't ask me that question. But I resist answering it. I'll ask things like, is this argument convincing to you? Are there any places in the argument where you feel like you don't fully understand what's going on? Are there questions that you have? We'll engage in that dialogue to help students identify what the strengths and potential weaknesses of an argument might be. I also have tried to, as much as possible, get away from giving points for doing things that students ought to do anyway. And this is a really tricky issue because you have to assess what you value. I know that. But at the same time, I want the students' overall grade to be based on how well they've mastered the objectives for the course. So to whatever extent possible, I have tried to get my students to see that it is to their benefit to complete the things that I ask them to complete. I use a lot of reading assignments from inquiry-based materials, a lot of pre-class assignments in between classes. Students learn real quick in my classes that if they don't do those, they're going to be clueless. They might as well not come to class because I come into class assuming that they've done it. And I put this little line on my syllabus like, if you're not completing the tickets into class, I reserve the right to drop your grade by a half a letter grade. Okay. I never have to do that, actually, because the vast majority of my students figure it out real quickly that this is something they need to do. This feels a lot better to me than just checking them off every day and saying, okay, 10% of your grade you get from doing those assignments. Though I certainly respect other people who do that, and I mean, I think it's a delicate balance in terms of how you motivate students to do the work outside of class. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to the most challenging part of my talk. This is actually the first banquet talk that I've ever given. So I chose to involve religion in it. So it might be the last banquet talk I will give also. So I don't know if you can see that picture. Does anybody know who this person is? This is a pastor by the name of Rob Bell. By a strange coincidence, I ended up attending the church that Rob Bell pastored for about a year before he left the church. He actually moved to LA to work on a TV series. But in 2011, he wrote a very controversial book. And I have no intention to get into the theology of what he wrote. But it was controversial enough that it landed him simultaneously on the cover of Heresy magazine and Time magazine. He was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people of the year in the world in 2011. What's intriguing to me about him is one of several things, but one of the quotes from his book is this: some communities don't permit open, honest inquiry about the things that matter most. Lots of people have voiced a concern, expressed a doubt, or raised a question only to be told by their family, church, friends, or tribe. We don't discuss those things here. And Rob Bell says, I believe the discussion itself is divine. It's interesting. I think that what Rob Bell is getting at here is the role of authoritarianism in religion and spirituality. There's actually been a lot of research on this. Back in the 60s, Alport made the observation that there's something about religion that makes people more prejudiced. There's also something about religion that makes people less prejudiced. It's an interesting tension. And what subsequent research has shown is that the religious beliefs themselves often promote very pro-social behaviors. But authoritarianism within religious institutions often does exactly the opposite. So there have been a bunch of studies that have shown a correlation between authoritarianism and things that we wouldn't consider positive, like prejudice, ethnocentrism, hostility towards people that are different than us. Here's an interesting quote. This is from a book called The Myth of Certainty by an author named Daniel Taylor. He says, in environments tainted with authoritarianism, every question creates a mini-crisis. Raises, if only momentarily, the possibility that the belief system is flawed or incomplete. Now, I think that some of us in the early stages of our career as teachers might have felt this way about our teaching. That I remember having panicked moments as a TA where when a student would challenge me and I'd feel like, oh my gosh, that's a question I don't know the answer to. And I would sort of bluff my way through it. And I ended up just looking bad, okay? It does not work well to try to make up answers to questions if you don't know the answers. I think I take a little different view now. I like questions. If I don't know the answer, I say, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. Let's think about that. And I think it reflects a move within me from a more authoritarian approach to one that values sort of an open-ended inquiry. In the research literature, open-minded, exploration-oriented approaches to religion are conceptualized using something called the quest construct. There are all these variables that measure the way people conceptualize and operationalize their religious beliefs. And questers are people who engage religion in sort of an ongoing, open-minded way. They acknowledge that some questions don't have clear-cut answers. They have a tentativeness of belief. They remain open to change. I actually think that these are characteristics that we ought to value as mathematicians. Okay? I'm doing research with students right now. In the first week, the project has gone in a completely different direction than I anticipated it would. But as mathematicians, that's not bad. We follow the mathematics where it leads us. Questions do not have clear-cut answers. Well, you might say, well, a proof is either logically valid or it's not. That may be the case, but what about, is a proof beautiful? Is it elegant? These are not questions that have clear-cut answers. And there's a lot of room for dialogue about those types of questions. Of belief. We don't accept a proposition until it's been proven to be true. And even propositions that have been proven to be true, there are errors in proof sometimes. Once I made one, really. So we remain open to change if we discover errors in our arguments. Okay? So I think that these are characteristics that we ought to value. And if there is any sort of spiritual analog of inquiry-based learning, I would think that it is quest religiosity. Why I think that is significant is because questers are consistently about the nicest, best people you can meet. They are more tolerant. They are more likely to be accepting of difference. They have this sort of general don't discriminate attitude, no matter how you measure discrimination. And this is one of the most consistent results in years of research on religiosity. And social psychologists have engaged these questions for the last 50 years. This is one of the most consistent and strongest conclusions. Okay? So I think that has some implications. Now this might be the biggest stretch of the talk, but maybe not. Can we view inquiry-based learning as a spiritual pursuit? I'm using the word spiritual. I'm not using the word religious, though perhaps it is that for some of you. Here's a definition of spiritual: of relating to or affecting the human spirit or soul as opposed to material or physical things. If I had to give a three-word, I hope it actually is 3 words, a 3-word definition of spirituality, I'd say it's one's inner life. And what I would suggest is that inquiry-based learning involves a cultivation of one's inner life in a way that promotes both individual responsibility and positive engagement and interaction with others. Those of you who responded to my little survey agree with me, by the way. I want to show you your answers to what you said were values promoted by inquiry-based learning. And I'm doing this in the form of a text cloud. The 4 biggest values that you listed: responsibility. The next one, self. Well, that's not a value I unhyphenated some words because you said self-reliance, self-determination, self-motivation, self-advocacy. There is this sense throughout inquiry-based learning that we remain autonomous. We remain in control of the learning experience. So a sense of self-responsibility. And then the next two are respect and listening. So you see, if you go back to what I said before, I don't think it's a stretch to say that inquiry-based learning promotes both individual responsibility and positive engagement and interaction with others. Which brings me to my last point, a conjecture. Okay. Here's my conjecture. I think that inquiry-based learning doesn't just make better students. I don't think inquiry-based learning just makes better mathematicians. I think inquiry-based learning has the potential to make better people. Okay? And that's the challenge that we have as practitioners of inquiry-based learning. And in true inquiry-based style, I'm going to close by leaving you with an assignment. So, thank you very much.